Well, we are live. Good morning and good afternoon to our listeners, wherever you may be around the globe. My name is Matthew Orr. I'm a Eurasia analyst at RAIN. I'm here with Carmen Colosi, our LATAM analyst, and we are going to talk about some of the implications of what's going on in Ukraine for Latin America. We had actually talked about having this discussion about a month ago when the topic would have been a little bit different, right? About kind of what is Russia's kind of long-term goals and objectives and tactics that they're using to expand their influence in Latin America. I think now the conversation is much different because we're talking about a process with a lot of global implications in really all spheres, and probably first and foremost in the economic sphere. But I guess to start, Carmen, my kind of first question for you is, how are Latin American countries, or maybe what are some of the biggest or most important, interesting ways that certain Latin American countries are reacting, and what are some of the implications for the region that you think are important?
Yeah, that's a great question. It varies drastically based on the country that we're talking about. When you look at a broad overview of the region, it's really, really interesting, Matt, because before in 2014 and in previous issues, we've seen Latin America take a stance where they are not going to intervene. Now things have changed. We've seen many leaders come out and condemn Russia by name. We've seen other leaders, say that they're potentially going to levy sanctions along with the US and EU. There are a few interesting exceptions to this. The biggest, of course, is Brazil. Looking at Brazil, we've seen a lot of domestic pressure to actually come out and condemn Russia. Bolsonaro, Brazil's president, is not willing to do that at this time. There's a few reasons behind it. Part of it has to do with the fact that Brazil is looking towards Russia to get nuclear information when it comes to submarines. Part of it is the fact that Russian fertilizers make up 22% of Brazil's fertilizer imports, which, wow, for a country with a huge agricultural industry, that's pretty important. But it is quite noticeable, and we've seen people in the U.S. kind of raise their eyebrows at this.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's a huge country that the United States would have loved to have kind of, join the diplomatic effort against Russia, particularly considering that Brazil is the first country in the BRICS or organization, and and I think kind of politically, there was this idea that Bolsonaro was kind of more aligning with the United States, and was kind of, as opposed to the Brazilian left or center left, was more kind of trying to realign towards the United States, and so this is kind of not as part of that trend.
Exactly. This is kind of buffing that idea. And, the US and Brazil have had their issues. Specifically when the Biden administration came in, there was a lot of pressure on Brazil over environmental policies. But this is just taking it to a next level of Brazil is not willing to kind of go with the US and West on this one. The notable exception to that is in the UN vote. Brazil supported the resolution to condemn Russia. But how Brazil is voting in the UN is differing quite drastically to how Bolsonaro and the Bolsonaro administration.
So they voted for. They didn't abstain in that UN vote.
They did not abstain.
Okay, that's fascinating. Okay, well that's interesting. In that and there was a lot of interesting things about that UN vote, because those UN votes, I think, are first off, they're very important for the Ukrainians and for the United States and for the West to show, look, we still have this diplomatic muscle, even if certain countries don't want to do economic things, or they don't want to join sanctions or boycotts. At least, as a principled position, we can get these countries on paper to have a certain position. And that resolution was very strongly worried. It was that we condemned Russia's aggression, and Russia should leave all Ukrainian territory immediately.
And what's interesting about the wording, Matt, is that Brazil actually argued to decrease some of the harshness of that wording. They were really pushing for that, and the US and other Western countries didn't go for that. But in the end, you do see that even in the UN vote, they were pushing to decrease some of the strength of that wording.
And that's fascinating. I didn't even know that. There was some other things I found interesting about the way that the voting went. One is that a lot of people were doing a direct comparison between this vote and a similar vote that took place in 2014 after Russia's annexation of Crimea. And at that vote, we had countries like, I believe, Cuba and Nicaragua who voted no. And so they openly supported the Russian position at that time. Now you have both of those countries moving into the abstain
They both
camp
abstained
and not voting with Russia. And I think that's particularly interesting for Nicaragua, because Nicaragua is one of only, I think, 5 or 6 countries in the whole world that recognize Russia's statelets that it's created in Georgia. And so it's kind of one of the vanguard of very close on Russia diplomatically. And so I think it was a little bit surprising to see them not, vote with Russia.
Completely agree. We've seen a lot more US pressure on countries like Cuba and Nicaragua. Specifically, you have to remember these countries are heavily dependent on the United States for trade. Over 50% of Nicaraguan exports go to the US. And so the US does have that ability to say, hey, if you're going to take a hard line on Russia, then we can, retaliate. And they've, thought about retaliating for other reasons. But
so you think you think that economics plays a big role. It's not that all of a sudden they have a new principled position and they realize that, because I think the idea was maybe that, okay, even this Russian aggression was so obvious and so unjustified that this was even a bridge too far that was uncomfortable for these governments to justify politically in some way. But really, maybe it's more just about kind of an economics element, and these countries don't want to be subject to additional kind of boycotts or things like that. Yeah,
completely. And what's interesting on that front is that we've seen the leaders of Nicaragua and also Venezuela come out and actively condemn the West and say, why are you putting this pressure on Russia? This is not your fight to fight. And having that kind of rhetoric. So again, there is that kind of discrepancy between what's going on in the UN and what's coming out of these presidential palaces.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fascinating. I think another really big topic we should hit on is the effects that this is going to have on kind of economic processes in the region. There's lots that come to mind. Well, let's start with kind of the near term ones, right? We're going to see fertilizer prices, food prices, things like that go up. Does that, lead to stability issues in certain Latin American countries, or are those concerns potentially overblown?
Oh no, that is, definitely a concern. When you look at it, you again have to look on a country by country basis. There are so many countries that are, net importers of food products. And there are also countries that are exporters. So countries like Argentina, where they do have that ability to cap exports and, keep those domestic prices a little bit lower. That's where you're not going to see the same kind of, domestic unrest. But I'm looking specifically at Brazil, where there are quite a bit of exports, but the government might not be so willing to cap exports in the same way that the Argentine government would be willing to. And so in that sense, you still have, a country where there's a ton of agricultural products, but it's very, very expensive to consume them.
Yeah, no, I mean that's fascinating, and as you said, right? I mean, Russia and also Belarus. We can't permit the biggest potassium fertilizer in the world is actually Belarusian. All of that product from both those countries is very difficult to get out of the country, and it's under sanction. So I mean, yeah, I'm not even really sure. We're talking about it a lot, the food security issue. It'll be interesting to see when people, if there's social unrest or things that associated with that.
Yeah. My question for you is, we see Brazil and other countries like Brazil taking this kind of wishy-washy stance. Do you think that Russia could look at countries like that and say, even though we're not going to export our fertilizers to other countries in the West or, in our own periphery, that they will say, hey, Brazil, you've been loyal to us, we'll make sure you get your fertilizer exports.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think there's going to be an attempt at that, right? Because Russia realizes that diplomatically they're quite isolated, and economically they're quite isolated, and they don't want to go back to this autarkic economic model. And so I think that they are going to very specifically look for those opportunities, um, and try to continue exports. I think that the difficulty is going to be finding mechanisms and
Yeah.
ways to do it that companies involved feel that they're legally safe, and that it's possible. We've got this question up on the screen. There's a disconnect between Latin American governments and their UN delegations. Is that a valid what do you think about that, Carmen? Is that characteristic of the region, that sometimes the diplomatic their UN actions might differ from um, general government thinking or things like that?
Somewhat. I think, when it comes to this specific case, we've seen countries go back and forth so quickly that, there's a certain pressure on a country to vote a certain way at the UN. And leaders are going to have a lot more autonomy to speak freely when they're on a radio show or giving a presidential address than we see in the UN, where there's a lot more pressure coming from Western countries. So there is that kind of discrepancy there. But I think in general, Latin American leaders and their UN delegations fall in line from kind of a historical sense.
Yeah, sure. The other interesting vote at that UN stuff that was interesting was El Salvador, right?
Yeah.
Abstained, when typically that's a country, per that example, that the U.S. is normally able to mobilize to support positions, particularly on an issue that they think is so important like this.
Completely. And this was quite surprising to me. We've seen President Bukele say that he is not going to comment on the war, when every other president, it seems, in the world was coming out and having something to say. Bukele was tweeting about Bitcoin, which is his big project in the country. And so he has, in some senses, entirely bypassed this issue and not commented at all. Of course, that's raising eyebrows in Washington. Of course, the US is kind of seeing this as, hey, there's this issue here. But I don't see this as Russia having, outsized influence in El Salvador. I think that this is really a president that has a very specific agenda, taking a non-alliance stance. And in that sense, we do see the UN delegation kind of falling in line. And saying, okay, we're going to abstain, but it's not abstaining in support in the same way that we could see from Cuba or Nicaragua, but it's abstaining just to say, I will not comment on this issue.
We were talking a lot about the official stances of these countries, the stances of their leaders, kind of putting you on the spot. But an interesting question that just came to mind for me is, what do you think are some of the countries where there's the biggest gap between what the government's line on this issue is and what kind of the people of that country, what are Latin American people saying? Is there any kind of there's been in Europe, certainly in the United States, around the world, there's been a lot of protests in support of Ukraine, predominantly in support of Ukraine. Are there any countries where that kind of tension is arising, where, for example, any place where people want their government to be more or maybe less supportive of Ukraine or anything like that?
Yeah, of course. I keep coming back to this example just because it's the biggest, but Brazil is a great example of this. We are seeing some, local and regional governments coming out and condemning. We even saw the vice president come out and, make some questionable comments towards Russia, which then the president Bolsonaro had to kind of walk back in a certain sense. And so we are seeing that conversation really play out domestically, where certain industries like the agricultural industry is saying, no, I think it's a good idea. We need our fertilizers. We want to make sure that this is our ally. But when you get into the more urban and kind of coastal communities, they are really saying, no, we need to stand with Ukraine. We need to have a hardline stance on this.
That's interesting. I also know that in one Brazilian state, there's actually a large Ukrainian diaspora.
There is,
South,
there's,
I forget which region that is, but it's between like Florianopolis, kind of in that area. Or I forget what it's.
yeah. I
I'm
don't
sure
have it on the top of my head, but it's interesting because with this, you find all of these interesting stories of an entire city in Brazil that speaks Ukrainian, that is Ukrainian, and
Yeah,
has a huge diaspora. And that's another interesting angle is you have a lot of Ukrainian refugees and migrants actually making the trek over to Latin America to be with their relatives that are already there.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. The other country I think we should bring up in particular is Argentina because
Yeah.
they've gone through a lot of political changes recently, and their governments have also had kind of interesting relationships with Russia in the past. What are the main issues, vis-a-vis Argentina and Russia and Ukraine right now?
Argentina is such an interesting example. When you look at what happened in like the immediate uh, you know rise up to the invasion, you saw the Argentine president going to Russia, meeting with Putin, having those conversations about collaboration. There was talk about military collaboration when it comes to training. Um, and in the aftermath, all of that melted away. We saw Argentina actively condemn Russia by name and stop any sort of military program and collaboration in that sense. And Matt, what's so interesting about this is that you have to look at Argentina's history.
Right.
Argentina views itself as having been invaded by an imperial power, which is Great Britain when it comes to the issue with the Malvinas or the Falkland Islands. And so that's really interesting in that a lot of Argentines have kind of said, hey, we sympathize with Ukraine. We have been invaded before, and this is still hurting us. So we are going to take a really hardline stance. And it's going to be really interesting to see how Russia kind of reacts to that, because Russia was a huge player in Argentina's vaccine campaign. They were, collaborating in several other senses, including with the military. And so now, that this has happened, we're not likely to see Russia be so favorable to Argentina. Of course, Argentina didn't make the,
And these are correct me if I'm wrong, but the current political forces in power in Argentina are from the ideological bent in parties that has historically been more aligned with Russia, as opposed to the previous government, which I believe the president was Macri, who was more pro-U.S. and I think would have been done even more to kind of vocally get maximally behind Ukraine on something like this.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. It's an interesting dynamic.
Yeah. Let's talk about a couple of the other countries in the region. Before this all started, a lot of the things that we were talking about between us two were, and you wrote an incredible piece on this. Is what can Russia really do to expand its influence in Latin America? Does it want to with these countries that it has close relations with? Are they really prepared to do things like have an expanded military presence? What is your assessment of what this what's going on right now means for that? I think that my baseline understanding is that this was already, unlikely, this idea that Russia would commit resources to really expand that, and that now it's even looking less likely. But I mean, what do you think about countries like Venezuela or Nicaragua or Cuba?
So from the Latin America perspective, we are seeing, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba kind of turn to Russia, say, hey, what can you do for us? And Russia was engaging them in this kind of bilateral relationship. But Matt, I'm actually going to throw this one back to you because I think you're the best person to explain this. Is what does Russia really want from these Latin American states that are nowhere near
Yeah.
their kind of sphere of influence?
Yeah.
What can Russia gain?
I think that no, thanks for throwing it back to me. I mean, I think that that's what's changed here is that now in the past, if there was this idea that we can essentially create this analogy where what the West or what the United States is allegedly doing in Ukraine, we can used increased military cooperation or some kind of influence in these countries to as a trade-off, essentially the idea that that's something we would revisit or draw down if the U.S. would draw down with their activities in Ukraine. But that nothing like that is going to take place, and it was pretty unlikely in the first place. And right, as you said, as you kind of implied, now Russia is in a place where it has even less resources to engage
Yeah,
in endeavors like this. And as we've talked about, my understanding is that these countries aren't really that concerned about, they don't need, certain advanced security systems. They're not worried about like a state on state conflict necessarily. And so, they don't want, expensive weapons systems, or they don't want to base a bunch of expensive Russian equipment in their country unless they're willing to get economic support that really makes their governments more popular and helps them in
yeah,
a way that they want. And I don't
completely.
think that Russia is willing to engage in the mechanisms to do that right now. But I think that this whole conversation gets to at least one final topic that I definitely wanted to touch on, which is that Russia, as President Putin keeps talking about right now, he said, the West default. It's not Russia that's going to default on its sovereign debt, which is a different topic, but it's actually the West that defaulted on its obligations to Russia because the
Mm,
West froze approximately $3 billion US dollars worth in Russian central bank assets in a
yeah,
really unprecedented move. And so Putin has been telling the world, look, if they can do this to Russia, they can do this to every country. So things like this had happened already to Venezuela and their government.
yeah,
Um, but now it's kind of, and of course they want to get China on board. And there's this idea that they want many more countries to get on board with efforts to de-dollarize their economies and move away from that and join kind of other systems to go around U.S. economic influence. Do you see any signs that that Latin American governments, particularly ones like Nicaragua, for example, you said are still dependent on the U.S. for trade, that's an initiative that's really going to gain traction in any speed?
so what's so interesting about this is that Latin American economies use the dollar basically to back their, um, very volatile currencies. They use the dollar as the main kind of central bank reserves
Mhm.
to, basically give a lot of kind of meaning to their own currencies.
Right.
So when it comes to countries like Argentina, Brazil, that are experiencing like incredibly high amounts of inflation right now, and likely in the future we're not likely to see them really draw down. That being said, we've seen Brazil kind of sell off some of its treasury bonds in response to this kind of plea for diversification
Interesting.
um, of the monetary service. And but when it comes to Latin America, there's really that issue is that because the domestic currencies are so volatile, whenever something happens, the immediate crisis will always overtake the long-term need or desire to decrease the
Yeah.
dependence on the dollar. So it's not likely in the kind of immediate term or even in the kind of medium term that we are going to see countries really kind of actively step up on this.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think you're right. A lot of it's probably going to be dependent on the speed at which Russia and China can actually go about even at places closer to home can even go about getting these systems kind of set up and normalizing transactions that don't use the dollar and things like that. But I think it's definitely something to watch in the Latin American space because China
Completely.
and Russia are huge. Or China really is is economically extremely active there, And if there's any desire, they might want to, indulge.
And I will note that one mechanism that's really, great that these countries use is currency swaps. So they'll swap, their kind of domestic currency for a currency in Latin America. And that's a great way that countries can kind of push this initiative, because they're saying, hey, we'll take your weak and volatile currency, and exchange it for a bit of a stronger one. And so that's kind of a charitable, quote unquote, act that a lot of these countries are doing.
Well, I mean, I guess we're kind of getting towards the end of our time. I mean, is there any other topics that you thought we should touch on, or anything that we missed that we should hit before we go?
No, I think we covered the lot. Thank you so much, Matt, or for taking the time to talk with me about this today. This has been incredibly interesting, and as always.
Yeah. Well, thanks to all our listeners. We hope you guys enjoyed it. Please, for more, if you want to read more, please just look at us on rain.com. Stratfor is our publication. So please check out our materials, and thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody.